This is our final session. I'd like to introduce our final keynote speaker, Mr. Duncan Stevenson. Mr. Duncan Stevenson's worked with the CSIRO for the last, for 27 years, developing interactive computer systems for industrial applications, which includes mineral exploration, mining, surgical simulation, and telehealth. He has a PhD in computer science and is currently the Honorary Associate Professor in the School of Computing at the Australian National University. His research interests cover requirements and design for interactive systems, matching technology to the needs of the application, and evaluating interactive systems. Please welcome Mr. Stevenson. Thanks.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Is the audio at the right level for me?
Yeah, that's excellent, Duncan. And
that's great.
And your slides are up.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm a computer scientist, and I've worked with surgeons on at least 4 big projects over those 27 years. And what I'd like to do is to give you some flavour of how surgeons and computer scientists can work together. And the particular technology you asked me to talk about is a robotic interface for, in this case, training simulators. Let me show you what they look like. I just need to get the focus. Okay, so this picture on the left is an early example of a robotic interface, probably still the most powerful. All the more recent ones are just covered up in plastic to make them look tidier. And when we first saw this in 1996, a lot of us thought, so what is this? How could it possibly be useful? Let me just guide you through the technology. It looks like one of those excavators that people bring in to dig up telephone lines. It's got a waist that pivots, an arm that moves, and what would have been a digger on an excavator. So 3 motors, waist, and 2 belt ones to move this point here, can exert a force. So the point about this robot is that it's the front end of a system. It's not the robot doing the work. So it's almost the complete converse of the Da Vinci system. What this can do, the active point is there at the end of the stylus. It can exert a force pretty much in any direction. This particular one had a working range of about 1.5 cubic feet because it was made in America. And it's got sensors. Pitch yaw and roll of this was probably a biro in the original prototype, and one clicker for a mouse button. It's strong enough to sustain holding up a jar of marmalade. It has a refresh rate of 1 kilohertz, which means it can simulate smooth glass, it can simulate sandpaper, it can simulate belly buttons. And what we did with it was to embed it in a system that let us put a virtual activity or a scene where the thing was. And so this sketch here, we were running a frame to hold a TV monitor up into a mirror so that the scene that you see is actually under the mirror, out of sight. And running it in stereo, you could program this thing to be whatever you felt like in the scenario. So it could be a grasper, could be a cutting tool, could be a poker, whatever. Some points that I would just checklist. And what we did then was create 3D models of the objects in our surgical simulation of anatomy that we could put in place, and then we could program how they should respond. Now, one of the things that isn't obvious with a robot, let me come back to the robot for a moment. In principle, this robot could take over, and we discovered that if we did that, people were terrified of it because it seemed to have a mind of its own. And so very early on, we built robotic interfaces to respond to the person. So for example, if you push against a brick wall, the wall pushes back at you. If you stop pushing, the wall stays put. Similarly, if you press on a rubber membrane, it'll push back, determined by how you press. So the response of this robot is entirely due to the user. And that means that the person using this simulator is in pure control. A quick photograph from a camera shot underneath showing what this framework actually looked like. And we bring in another point. If we've got a haptic interface, haptic is the adjective to describe one of these devices, that gives us interface to a simulation, we can add other things as well. And so one of the ways of thinking about building a simulator is you can build more than one thing. Here we have a microphone and a speaker, so that you can, if the simulation requires sound, you produce it. So you can add levels of plausibility, a bit like we saw in the previous talks. Looking over the shoulder of this person, you've got two hands, so you can do things with the other hand. In this case, it's a multi-dimensional mouse with trackball. So the process of putting a robotic interface into your simulator is really about how do you embed it in what you want to do and what else is there. So we first saw this thing in 1996. And as Professor Hamdorf's talk mentioned, in April the 1st, 2000, CTEC was opened. And here we are with a haptic workbench as an early demonstration of the possibility of having a robotic interface in a simulator. In this example, we had a PhD student, a doctor, working on a PhD from one of the hospitals in Sydney. And he was interested in what happens if you put haptic feedback onto a laparoscopic tool. So we built an example in under this frame. We embedded the haptic device. The local hospital donated some tools and some gowns, and we set up an experiment to see what it would feel like to put haptic interactions in this situation. And you'll notice we've got some levels of reality. We've got drapes, we've got a screen. You'll also notice the problems of working with a computer scientist, because this person is standing in precisely the wrong place. They really should be standing over here at right angles to the angle of work. And that brings up a really important issue, that bridging the two disciplines, computer science and in surgical research, we computer scientists often don't understand what is really happening. And if you let a computer scientist run off on a frolic, you'll end up with situations like this. So a really key component of building anything like this and working between surgeons and computer scientists is that lived experience. And so in one of my projects, the surgeons invited me to come and be in the operating theatre and watch what happened. And it meant that the questions I asked after those experiences started to make sense to them. So levels of realism and getting the computer scientists to work together with you. The example that I really wanted to talk about is this one. So Professor Stephen O'Leary from Melbourne University had seen our technology over the 2 or 3 years leading up to 2004. And he wanted to, he saw that this was an ideal example of simulating surgery, because in temporal bone surgery, you're holding a drill and it vibrates and you're working with a three-dimensional entity, in and around the organs of hearing. And he wanted to simulate that as a precursor to putting his students in either the cadaver laboratory or in the operating theatre. And the first thing he did was he sat us down and he gave us a lecture on how he thought about the surgical approach. And he understood that we needed to learn from him what he wanted. And so we had a collaboration that built a system to simulate temporal bone surgery. This is what the screens look like. And you'll notice, working back, this whole frame here is really a research construct to let researchers use a haptic device for a purpose. And we decided early on that it didn't need to look like being in the operating theatre, because that was that was out of scope for the sort of training that Stephen wanted to do. So we stuck with our general purpose: monitor, mirror, shutter glasses, haptic device. And what we did was we simulated as best we could the view down a surgical microscope. In plain view, sure, but here it is. And because we've got a simulation, the original data came from a high-resolution scan of a cadaver. The anatomy was essentially correct, but we could do things that were out of scope of normal cadaver samples. We could make things translucent and teach the trainee to think about the organs inside the bone, and then come back to the bone and dissect it away. So we could add levels of things that couldn't be done in real life. As it happens, we were running with two systems, but one data set. So these two were interconnected, and you'll see in here 3 implements. So the trainee had a drill and an irrigation sucker, and the teacher had a haptic pointer, which could be converted into an annotation or a prod or a drill at whim. So the system that we built went a bit beyond realism so that certain things could be taught. Now, what we, just as a note here, this concept of running 2 systems doesn't have to be side by side. So the very first time we did this, the instructor was in California and the person role-playing the student was up on stage in Canberra at a simulation technologies meeting. And we borrowed some ridiculously large bandwidth between the 2 countries across the Pacific. This particular exercise went into evaluation as well. So here's one of the trainees. We rounded up all 11 junior nose and throat trainees, all the ones we could find on the east coast of Australia, plus one from Adelaide, and brought them to Max in Spring Street. So on this particular day, they spent an hour in this situation. They got taught a technique that they hadn't seen before. They got to practice it repeatedly, which is one of the things that Professor Hamdorf mentioned. Then we gave them a cup of tea to calm them down and put them in the wet lab with a cadaver sample and asked them to repeat what they learned to camera. So this was a research study of the whole process, as well as giving some understanding of the individual trainees' feedback in learning. Where does this go? So a possible direction that might have come off was to take that idea and then start looking at making the thing more realistic. And here's an example of a slightly smaller haptic device and a simulator of a surgical microscope with a TV camera inside it, a TV display, I should say. So what I want to emphasize here are a few things. The standard computer science model is that you understand the technology, you make up your mind what it is you want to do, you set the scope, and then you evaluate what you've done. And what I would be saying is, to follow on with the discussions from CTEC, they're evaluating the students, but it would be really interesting also to evaluate how well the teaching system works. So I would be, from a computer science point of view, be saying that each teaching situation becomes a research experiment. Not only how well the students are doing, but how well does this system work? And so that you would be building continuous refinement into whatever design you have of a simulation lab. So these two papers, this paper reports on the experiment I just described, and you'll notice that we have the surgeons and the computer scientists as authors. But our experience was built in some ways on this earlier paper. In 2002, 3, 4, the RAC's annual meeting was in Brisbane, and Anthony Gallagher was one of the keynote speakers, and he talked about the precision needed to create a randomized double-blinded study for surgical training. And my feeling is that in line with a lot of the previous speakers, that level of academic rigor is really important in any form of simulated training. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Duncan, that was fascinating. And it's obviously you've been in that field, or this field with incorporating with surgeons for quite a long time. I suppose the question for you is where to now? What do you envisage, using the haptic sort of systems for training? Certainly one of the issues with, say, robotics or other training modules is that haptics is difficult to replicate. On training models, it's very hard to replicate. What would you see as the future for this? Unfortunately,
We live in Australia, and the research support for taking these ideas into production and into use is fairly low. So even our senior managers within CSRO had trouble distinguishing between what we have here and the Da Vinci system. And in fact, we were at that same meeting in Brisbane. Our system was side by side with the Da Vinci.
Yeah.
And it was clear we were different, but it wasn't clear to our management. And in fact, they ended up shutting down our work because their feeling was people have already done that.
Yeah.
My feeling is that haptics will evolve, and but what this piece of work highlights is that you can make decisions about how much reality you want in your simulation. You can put a boundary. So, for example, a classic mistake that in temporal bone surgery is to puncture one of those blood vessels. And the decision we made was, if that happened, the screen would just go red.
Yeah.
And the student would click on the Band-Aid icon to reset.
Yeah.
And we didn't need to simulate blood flowing out of, because that was out of scope.
Yeah.
That wasn't what they were being taught. So we chose, if there were catastrophic mistakes, we'd flag them, let them back off. And so we were able to make decisions about what was important.
Yeah, excellent.
And in some ways, that's probably the learning to come from this, whether or not you have a haptic device in your simulator or whether you have some other form of virtual reality.
Yeah, excellent. Look, I've got a question from Dr. Harry Bundy, who's a neurosurgeon. How do you get a computer scientist and a surgeon to the same room? And once there, how do you get them to speak together to build and utilize technology meaningfully? How did you go through that process?
I went through that process because there was a small crumb of money left over from someone's grant.
Yeah.
And we were interested in the example that Dr. Bandy's referring to specifically, where I was involved in studies of using image displays within the operating theatre. Computer scientists, and in particular ones who are interested in the human side of things, are unbelievably curious. And it doesn't take much. It takes an invitation to bring them together. That's how I would see it. And we, the surgeons that I spent time with, we had cups of coffee in the coffee lounge at the hotel. Sorry, at the hotel at the hospital, and we we had enthusiasm.
Hmm.
And I think the enthusiasm, certainly from a human-computer interaction perspective, is a privilege to be invited to work with surgeons.
Absolutely. Duncan, you've really opened it up for us a little bit. And I think all of us are actually sitting down. We all live with technology on a daily basis, particularly with communication. And, communication's become a big issue, even in medicine. Thank you for your, fascinating insight into what you've done probably over the last couple of decades to get to this point. I really appreciate your contribution today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.